Welcome to New Wave Global. I am Asad Ejaz Butt. Ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister of India, Narendra Modi, was in the US 2 weeks ago. He met the newly elected American President, Donald Trump. The two heads of the states had numerous discussions that revolved primarily on India-US trade and Trump's ambitions of slapping tariffs like he did on China on India. Looking at the trade statistics between two countries, it seems that now the US must be concerned about its trade relations with India, as the trade deficit tilting in India's favor is nearly $100 billion now. The US is a major partner is a major trading partner for India, contributing around 18% of India's total exports. Whereas on the US side, the India is not such a major partner, contributing only 2.3% of all of US exports. So therefore, if you look at this kind of imbalance in the power dynamic, it seems rational for the American president to to kind of start thinking about such tariffs against India, like he did in the case of China. But then at the same time, pundits who talk about economic liberalism, free trade in the world, don't see uh, the tariff plans of the American president in the same light. So today, to have this discussion, I have a very relevant guest. Dr. Athar Mansoor is joining me from the United Kingdom. He's placed at the University of Cambridge. He's a PhD researcher. Um, who does a lot of work on innovation policy and national competitiveness. So, therefore, since we wanted to have this discussion about India-US trade, there was none more relevant than Dr. Athar Mansoor, who looks at India and looks at US in a particular perspective. Let's talk to him and try to understand what would be the response of the Indian government, how they would see the plans of the American president, and does he really think that Donald Trump would go ahead with placing tariffs on India? Let me welcome Dr. Athar Mansoor. Thank you for joining.
Yes, thank you so much, Asad. Thank you for inviting, and it's a great pleasure to talk to you. And it's on a very relevant topic, which is very relevant to my research. And also, I think the world is looking at this Trump 2.0 era as something which is full of surprises, surely as of now. And in case of India, it has also surprised the world. So I'm very glad that you have invited me. Thank you so much.
My first question, I think it's a loaded question, but I wanted to ask this. Do you really think that this would have taken the Indian administration, the Indian Foreign Office by a lot of surprise? Because Modi was very close to President Trump during Trump's previous era, and India had thought that it had sort of aligned its interest with the Americans. But all of a sudden, do you think that this would have come as a shock for the Indians?
Absolutely. I think, yes, it's a shock because you see, in terms of bilateral relationship between India and US, when we go back to Trump 1.0 and Modi 2.0, because Modi 3.0 is right now in progress and Trump 2.0 has started. Modi got re-elected last June, July, and Trump last November. So we see that Howdy Modi and Namaste Trump, these were clear manifestations of growing bond between the two countries, and definitely it has geostrategic, geoeconomic perspective behind the two leaders thinking of how to develop this relationship. And even Biden and Barack Obama, if you see the last 2 decades, the relationship has been strengthening, and the trajectory of the relationship has been growing in a very healthy manner. But yes, it's a surprise. But at the same time, I think this is something which must be anticipated and expected, given what Trump is doing world over. So Trump is not only confining himself to China or maybe Mexico or Canada. Even you see, Canada, nobody could have thought that Trump would, say that Canada is welcome to become 51st state of the US. But he is coming up with these kind of strange, maybe political rhetoric or narrative or whatever you call it in political discourse. But it should have come. It must have come as a surprise. But at the same time, I think the political and economic experts are savvy enough to anticipate that Trump cannot take decisions in isolation.
Yeah.
American economy is integrated with the world. It is integrated, fully integrated kind of an economy. No, no, except I think North Korea. It's everywhere. So even in North Korea, I think Trump 1.0, he went to North Korea and he tried to integrate it as well. So I think it's something which we must see as a surprise, but at the same time, I think we must have anticipated. Yes.
So US is one of the major IT importers of India. It's one of the major ones. Of course, India is a big IT exporter, so it's kind of trading with a, a majority of European countries and now African countries, which are major IT importers. Countries like South Africa, for instance, Sweden, Denmark. All of these are major IT importers from India, but the US remains like a big IT import market for India. Do you think that even though the IT sector might be protected from these tariffs, but do you think that that kind of trade would be affected also?
You see, I think it's a little early to exactly and precisely identify what sectors would be really hurt in terms
Yeah.
of India's imports into the US. But surely, because you see, IT is something which is critical for India. India's IT exports have surpassed even diamonds, right? So it's something which is very close to Prime Minister Modi's heart. And given India's technological, you see, the way they want to grow technologically, IT will play a very important role. And the way American companies are coming into the Indian market, we see Apple, we see Tesla, and Google, and other companies. It's important that India maintains its IT competitiveness across the world,
Yeah.
and for that it has to tap into US market with full throttle, because US is a place where the effective use of IT and where the first adoption of any IT new product if takes place within the US market, it becomes very easy to scale that to the world level. So India would never try to let those would try its best not to let the IT exports to US plummet. But it depends. I cannot specifically or precisely see what would be in terms of tariffs on IT products or IT service sector, but I think it will also be covered. That's my hunch.
I think there was some mention about the oil in the joint statement that the two leaders issued. I think there was something about oil and gas as well. So I think that is one sector that could be initially impacted. Um, I wanted to I wanted to talk about the power dynamic that I talked about in my intro also. Do you think that India is not the major trade partner that the US is for India, and therefore it's easier for President Trump to dictate his terms with a country like India than perhaps it was with a country like China, where even though he's been talking about tariffs, I think there is some that air of circumspectness about his conversations about China. But with India, I thought I read the joint press statement that he's 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 more inclined to sort of dictate his terms as opposed to having like a bilateral conversation. What are your thoughts about it?
I think yes, it's India is not is as big a trade partner as China in terms of total outlay of the trade. I'll share with the viewers the figures from U.S. Trade Representative, which is an executive office of the President of the U.S. The
Yeah.
total outlay is about 130 billion, which is a little less than 130 billion. And the US exports into India is about 41.8, and this is for 2024. The figures are for 2024. The US exports to India were about 42 billion, and US imports from India were about 88 billion. So the overall deficit was hovering around 45 to 46 billion dollars. And we compare it with China, China's and US trade deficit is about 250 billion dollars.
Yeah.
So much bigger. So it's about 5 times that of India. So India, in terms of India, I think Trump is in a more strategic position, more powerful, as you say, in terms of power dynamics position to dictate his terms. And that is why he has, I don't know, he has forced it or not. But given India's sluggish or slowing down of economic growth rate, India is expecting around 6.3% ending this March, which is the slowest in 4 years. I don't know, maybe he's forcing India to buy those F-35 stealth aircraft,
Yeah.
which are going to cost millions, several hundred millions, rather going to billions, and also the oil and gas. So, although it's part of his reciprocal strategy, which he says that you charge us, we charge you, and we have to have a fairer field, level playing field for each other. But at the same time, I think it will become very difficult for India because domestic conditions are not very healthy right now. And although the 6.3% growth rate is not bad, but comparing it with previous 4 years, it's a little going down, right? And then the unemployment rate is also rising, 8.3%, which is zero point 0.3 percentage points higher than the last year. And then after pandemic recovery was good initially, but currently many people are still stuck in that labor force in agriculture, which was considered initially as a parking space or a parking lot, but they are now, not coming back to the cities because of not too many jobs there. So Modi is under pressure to create jobs, and that's why he has given those tax cuts to the middle class also. But I think overall, yes, Modi understands the domestic front and international front, and Trump also knows it. So Trump is in a more powerful position in this power dynamics to dictate something over India. And I think this F-35 stealth deal would be something which India may not afford at current point in time.
You talked about economic growth. I think one major factor in India's case, as I see it, is that post-COVID, because India was very badly affected by COVID. So post-COVID, there was this low base effect, as we call it in economics, because the markets were closed for a year or so in India. So then we saw this period of very high growth starting in 2022. India started growing really well. And now I think things are coming back to normalcy, and as they return to normalcy, we see growth coming back to pretty much their long run average of the last decade or so, which is around 6%. I think in Modi 1.0, as you call it, growth was pretty much hovering around that number, 6 to 7% average, which is high for an economy of the size of India. Um, I'm more interested in knowing, since you talked about reciprocal tariffs. I'm more interested in understanding, is India also imposing some kind of tariffs on American exports into India? My understanding was that there won't be a very high incidence of Indian tariffs on American imports, purely for political reasons. I've not looked at the data. What are your thoughts on that?
I think politically, India, has played very smart over the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah.
And the reason is, I think, made primarily political stability. As 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 Modi, we are entering into 3.0, and 3.0 is now progressing. So India has claimed that over the years, it has maintained its tariffs within the limits prescribed by the WTO. So the average, which Indian sources quote, and I quote from their sources, is that around 17%. So their average Indian tariffs are 17%, which they say it's maintainable as per the WTO regime, which requires that the tariff should be within some limits. But at the same time, you see, India has a problem domestically. It's a very big market. It's more than 1.4 billion people, and
Yeah.
it depends on its domestic growth a lot, its domestic consumption a lot, and employment and job creation. And to maintain that 6% is not easy. It has been doing it, but going into, and the population is not going to, like China, they don't have that, for example, which we call the draconian policy of one child, having one child. They can't I think they can't do it. It's a democratic nation, it's world's biggest democracy. They would not be able to do it. So the population is going to keep growing. Millions of people are entering into the unemployment age. And I agree that India has tried to alleviate some kind of, or try to bring some kind of give some kind of good signal to Trump by lowering tariffs on products like bourbon whiskey and in American luxury motorcycles produce, especially Harley Davidson has welcomed it a lot. That Indian market, India is going to reduce and give tariff concessions. But their overall India's tariff regime is not too high. It's not too high. And although the critics of Modi claim that he should have kept it high because he has to balance the domestic job creation with the international relations, right? Especially trade relations. If he does not keep them high, the local industry would suffer. That's normal. I don't know. You know economics more than me, but you know these kind of protectionist policies, they usually are for the local industry, right? So
Right.
giving in view India's growth rate of 6%, local industry must be growing there, right? That's why they are 6% growth rate on
Right.
average.
Right.
So they want jobs, more jobs for people, especially for young people, so that India has that problem of crime also, problem of drugs also, and there are, I mean, it's not easy. Managing a population of 1.5 billion almost is not easy. And so Modi is in a much more tricky situation than many other countries of the world. Even he's in a trickier situation than China. China has one party, one rule, and they can impose any policy they want, but Modi cannot do it. So I think he tries to maintain some balance, and you are right. So the tariffs are not that high, and they maintain that they are within the prescribed limits by WTO.
Right. There's another very important question that I thought I should put in front of you is this question about other sort of mid-tier emerging economies in the world who trade with the US. Now that President Trump is creating disincentives for trade with the US of countries that have a favorable trade balance with the US, countries like India and China, who have a favorable trade balance with the US. Do you think that this presents a great opportunity for countries perhaps like Pakistan or other countries who now have a higher incentive of trading with the US because it creates, these kind of tariffs on selected countries are creating this uneven global sort of trade dynamic in which countries that are, that the US president would slap tariffs against would not have any incentive to trade with the US. But then, this presents a great opportunity for other countries that have like a very small trade with the US to kind of expand it. And do you see that there would be that kind of a catch-up effect in terms of exports, and the US would now start exploring new markets?
Surely, I think you see, US is a consumer-driven economy, right? You are based in US. You know how high consumption is in the US, right? And especially those goods which are not produced by the US itself. That's why it imports, right?
Right.
And countries like middle income or low middle income country like Pakistan or other emerging economies, or maybe some in Africa, I think they can leverage upon this opportunity. This is a great opportunity. It depends on their national policy framework for trade in terms of their commerce, in terms of their competitiveness also. Because the US economy would not buy third grade or fourth grade products,
Hmm.
right? They would try to focus on at least second grade, but preferably first grade products.
Yeah.
So if the quality of these countries, the quality regime, their commerce ministries, their trade ministries, their industries, their SMEs, if they can infuse some kind of tonic into their veins.
Yeah.
For example, Pakistan has a good SME base. It's not a bad country in terms of SMEs and cottage industry, right?
Right.
But in Africa, the amount of investments which have gone into Africa from China under the Belt and Road Initiative and other, like Ethiopia, I had never heard of. When I was growing up, I had heard of Ethiopia as a drought-ridden country. I had seen only starved people with their, skinny, with their skeletons and their, ribs shown on the TV. But
Yeah.
now Ethiopia is one of the, I think many people have gone there and they have narrated stories at how it has changed over the last 10 years or so. So I think it's a great opportunity. It depends on those countries' policy framework, how the governance is improved in terms of production and in terms of export policies. So US would be, I think, interested in diversifying. Why not? Why not diversify into those and not depend on China, Canada, Mexico, EU, or India? These were the major trading partners for US.
Right. And do you think there'll be slapping tariffs on countries like India and China, big, uh, especially in China's case, big trading partners of the US? And I'm sure that when it comes to America's own industry, these countries are the major source of inputs into the America's own industrial base, own industrial process. So do you really think that this would also kind of affect America's own exports? It would affect American economy, perhaps industrialization within the US itself?
I think it can. It can. Many imports are from these countries, like semi-finished goods and work in progress kind of inventory, which the accountants call, I think, WIP. So these can be, and these can hit America also. But at the same time, I think Trump's longer run vision, 3 to 4 years from now, is to put pressure within the domestic industry of the US to
Hmm.
move towards self-reliance. So is Make America Great Again, MAGA slogan. I think it's dependent on how America improves its industrial productivity. And again, productivity is a purely economic notion, and how to use capital, labor, their proportion, and especially technology. So as we say that total factor productivity has to improve. So if
Yeah.
the total factor productivity improves and technology is really used well in within the US, and as the AI race accelerates and takes interesting turns in the coming few months or years, I think it would be good that America puts pressure from the policy side onto its business sector to revive itself, to reinvigorate itself, and to start exporting to the world, not just importing, but start exporting. But at the same time, I think within the American labor, it's a problem. The American labor has moved up in the value chain for many years. And to do maybe from their perspective, those kind of petty things for production, that's not. But, machines, robots, those can be used. And those can be, I think, really, really beneficial for the American economy in the long 3 to 4 years.
Do you think President Trump's, since I talked about whether this came as a shock to India, looking at it from the flip side, do you think President Trump's, hurried sort of gestures to slap tariffs on countries is a sign of weakness and is also perhaps um, an indication that the American economy today is not competitive enough to compete with these countries in a free market. And therefore, President Trump wants to set up this protectionist regime using the political power dynamics that we've discussed. But economically, the US is not as competitive as an economy it was perhaps 30, 40 years ago.
Absolutely. US has been losing its economic competitiveness in terms of world's demand. So it's not about just what 340 million or 350 million people within the US want
Hmm.
or what they consume. US had been looking the world over. It had been, how did Britain develop? How did Britain? It was not just through colonization. It was also about the industrial revolution and then producing for the world and
Yeah.
improving its productivity. And US had also been doing, but the way China has grown, so US has definitely lost its economic competitiveness, and these signs of these decisions for protectionism and challenging economic liberalism are some, to a certain extent, yes, weakness, to a certain extent, frustration, to a certain extent, they are signs of indicating or signaling to the world that we are not in a position to let you flourish maybe at our cost.
Yeah.
So it's a political economy game. It's not just of economics, it's about politics also, right? You have discussed this also. So yes, it's a sign, but at the same time, I think, as Trump always identifies, and all, at least on the face of it, every political leader would say that the national interest is supreme. So I think he's an elected president of a democracy, coming with a kind of his comeback is unprecedented in American political history. So if Americans have voted him into the office, they must know that what he would like to bring in terms of surprises. And
Yeah.
I think they have entrusted him with taking decisions which they think are ultimately in their benefit. But as an independent observer, as an independent analyst, I think these are surely signs of weaknesses. America has definitely lost its competitiveness, and as some public intellectuals in the West have identified, this is the century is in the East have identified that this is the century which belongs to the East. America knows it's not anymore going to lead the world in a unipole, right? So if China and India are, China is definitely positioned to become the biggest economy. Who can stop China? Even if they start importing lesser from China, do you think China is not going to export? Chinese products are not going to be required in other parts of the world? They
Mm.
are, and the way they are growing. So overall, yes, there can be dips and ups and troughs and crusts and booms and busts, as economists point out. But nobody can stop India and China. They are, in fact, from a political standpoint, they are correcting an aberration of history. And mind you, that's very important because from 1 AD to 1800 AD, the pivot of economics and politics lied with the East. So for only 225 years to be precise, the pivot has shifted towards the West. So East is coming back and India, and they are leveraging on their numbers. So 3 billion people in these two countries, it's not a small number. They have very strong domestic markets, and I don't know. Yeah, so interesting times in which we are living.
My last question, we're approaching the end of our slotted time for the interview, but my last question to you, Dr. Mansoor, would be um, about the Indian, very strong Indian, and a very large contingent of Indians living in the US, very strong Indian diaspora in the US, the Sundar Pichais of the world. Do you think there is an important role for them to play to create like this sort of even balanced playing field for Indian businessmen in the US? And perhaps we've been talking about the Indian lobby also, the Indian political lobby within the US. Do you think that they'd be sharpening their knives right now?
Yes, I think it's not the Sundar Pichais or the now it's Kash Patel also, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Director of the FBI, and then Ajay Banga. I think he's the president of the World Bank,
World
right?
Bank, yes, yes.
So Indians are not just in the IT, they are now in FBI, they are in the World Bank, and they have very strong. And I think over the years, they have built themselves as a community as well in India. Again, I'm not in a very good position sitting here in the UK to comment on how you are in a more, I think you are in a more appropriate or a better position to understand how Indian diaspora and expatriates are working in the US. But they are definitely, they play a very important role in their economy. I don't know their exact number, but yes, they would definitely use their political muscles, their economic muscle, their connections, their networks to minimize any damage to the Indian. Because at the end of the day, they are Indians. And they have their connections back home. Many of them have invested back home. Many of them regularly go back home, just like Pakistanis. We are interested in what is happening back home. So they would take all steps, all measures to keep the Indian national interest supreme, and they would take all actions given their sincerity towards the American polity, towards the American state. At the same time, I think they would balance their own countries. I can't say if they are American citizens. Yes, America is first for them, but still they have connection with the soil, so they would take all measures.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think in the Indian case, you have to give up the Indian nationality, otherwise you cannot hold a dual nationality. So you're an
All right.
NRI kind of thing. I don't know if these people are NRIs, but they could have, some of them could have given up Indian nationality to become
Right,
American
right,
citizens.
right. So as per their law, they can't hold dual nationality.
Yeah,
Right.
yes, yes. Thank you, Dr. Mansoor, for joining me and for this great conversation. We try to continue this in another session, and I hope my audience would have learned a lot from you.
It has been an honor and pleasure. Thank you, Asad, for inviting me.